A lot of gardeners think they spend the most money on plants. In reality, that's often not where the money disappears. Sometimes it disappears one small purchase at a time. A bottle for seedlings, a treatment for pests, a product for cleaning tools, something for disease prevention, something else for containers. Individually, none of them seem expensive. But here's the question that changed the way I look at garden spending. How many of those purchases happen because we never considered a tool we already own? That's where hydrogen peroxide becomes surprisingly interesting. Not because it's the best solution for everything, but because it keeps showing up in places most gardeners never expect. And the deeper I looked into it, the less this became a story about hydrogen peroxide. It became a story about how much money gardeners may be spending without realizing it. The first example is small, almost boring actually, but it reveals a spending mistake that starts before a plant has even broken through the soil. 1. Seed germination accelerator. One of the easiest ways hydrogen peroxide can save money happens before a plant even exists. A lot of gardeners run into slow or uneven germination and immediately start looking at seed-starting products, boosters, special mixes, or additives that promise better results. But sometimes the problem isn't a lack of products. Here's the surprising part. Many gardeners assume poor germination automatically means they need another product. Sometimes the first thing they actually need is a different test. That's where hydrogen peroxide enters the conversation. If a packet of seeds struggles to germinate, many people assume they need to buy another product. In reality, they may want to test a simple hydrogen peroxide soak first. Instead of adding another item to the shopping cart, you're first seeing whether a bottle you already own can accomplish the same goal. There is a limitation here. Hydrogen peroxide won't turn poor quality seed into great seed, and it won't solve every germination problem. Temperature, moisture, and seed quality still matter, but it can be a useful first step before spending money on specialty germination products. And that's the pattern to watch throughout this video. The savings aren't coming from finding better products. They're coming from discovering products you may never have needed to buy in the first place. 2. Eliminating fungus gnats. Here's where the costs start repeating. If you've ever dealt with fungus gnats, you already know how easy it is to spend money over and over again. Sticky traps, more sticky traps, different sticky traps. And yet the tiny flies keep showing up. What makes hydrogen peroxide interesting isn't that it targets the flies, you see. It's that gardeners often use it because the real problem is happening in the soil. The adults flying around are annoying. The larvae below the surface are what keep the cycle going. That's why some gardeners end up buying the same solution repeatedly without ever feeling like the problem is gone. The hidden expense isn't the traps. It's the repeated purchase cycle. Every failed attempt makes the next purchase feel justified. Then suddenly a minor issue has turned into a recurring garden expense. The useful insight here is not simply that hydrogen peroxide may help with fungus gnat management, it's that it changes where you're looking. Instead of focusing only on the symptom, you're looking at the source. That creates a different spending decision. Before buying another product, ask whether the actual cause has been addressed. Of course, hydrogen peroxide isn't a guaranteed fix. Heavy infestations often require multiple corrective steps, and watering habits may need to change as well. But the financial lesson is bigger than fungus gnats. Many gardening expenses repeat because the root cause survives. And that brings us to a much more expensive category of mistakes. 3. Sterilizing pruning tools. This one doesn't look like a money-saving use at first. That's exactly why it gets overlooked. Most gardeners think about disease after a plant becomes sick. Few think about the tool that may have helped spread the problem. Hydrogen peroxide is commonly used as a cleaning and sanitizing aid for garden tools between plants. Most gardeners see a sick plant and think about treatment. Very few stop and ask what helped the problem spread in the first place. That's where the hidden expense begins. The treatment isn't always the first cost. Sometimes it's the last cost in a chain that started much earlier. Suddenly the most expensive purchase wasn't the treatment. It was the preventable mistake that happened earlier. That's the hidden realization. You may not be buying disease control products because your garden is unusually difficult. You may be buying them because contamination was never interrupted in the first place. The decision shift here is important. Instead of waiting until symptoms appear and then shopping for solutions, you begin treating sanitation as part of prevention. Hydrogen peroxide isn't a substitute for proper diagnosis, and it won't solve every disease issue. But as a low-cost tool cleaning option, it can help reduce one of the easiest ways problems move around a garden. And notice what's happened so far. We started by avoiding a small purchase. Then we avoided repeated purchases. Now we're talking about preventing future treatment expenses altogether. The savings are getting larger because the mistakes are becoming more expensive. 4. Rescuing plants from root rot. The next level of savings is very different. Up to now, we've mostly been talking about products. This is about plants. One of the most frustrating moments in gardening happens when a healthy-looking plant suddenly starts declining. Leaves yellow, growth slows. The plant looks tired no matter what you do. A common reaction is to assume the plant is finished. Many gardeners immediately move toward replacement. New plant, new pot, new soil, new expense. That's why hydrogen peroxide becomes interesting in root rot situations. Gardeners sometimes use it when they suspect roots are struggling in overly wet conditions, because it can help introduce oxygen into the root zone while addressing some of the conditions associated with root decline. Not every declining plant can be saved, but many gardeners calculate treatment costs long before they calculate replacement costs. The expensive mistake happens earlier. When a plant begins declining, people often calculate the cost of treatment. They rarely calculate the cost of replacement. A mature tomato plant, pepper plant, rose or container specimen represents time, growth, effort, and money already invested. Replacing it often costs far more than attempting a reasonable recovery first. That's the hidden realization. A struggling plant is not automatically a lost investment. The decision shift becomes, before replacing, ask whether recovery is still possible, because sometimes the most expensive gardening purchase is the replacement you didn't need to make. 5. Stopping powdery mildew early. Now we're moving into a category of losses that many gardeners never count. Harvest losses. Powdery mildew often starts small. A few spots, a little discoloration. Nothing that seems urgent. That's exactly why it becomes expensive. Hydrogen peroxide is commonly discussed by gardeners as one possible early intervention tool when mildew first appears. What matters here isn't the product. It's the timing. Many people don't lose money because mildew appeared. They lose money because they waited. A fungal problem that affects a few leaves today can affect productivity much more seriously later. Productivity drops long before many gardeners realize how much harvest they're losing. By the time visible damage becomes impossible to ignore, part of the season's production may already be gone. The hidden cost isn't the treatment. It's the harvest that never happened. That's a completely different way to evaluate the problem. Instead of asking, "What should I buy to fix this?" the better question becomes, "What happens if I do nothing?" That shift alone can save more money than the treatment itself. Of course, hydrogen peroxide is not a guaranteed cure for fungal diseases, and serious outbreaks often require broader corrective measures. But the lesson remains powerful. Delay often creates larger costs than action. And that leads directly into a type of loss many gardeners don't even realize they're experiencing. Up to this point, we've mostly talked about money you don't have to spend. The next discoveries are different. They involve losses that never appear on a receipt. No purchase, no warning, just time disappearing. And for many gardeners, those losses end up costing more than anything we've discussed so far. 6. Preventing damping off. If you've ever started seeds indoors, you've probably experienced this without realizing what happened. Everything looks fine. The seeds germinate. Tiny seedlings emerge. Then suddenly they collapse, one after another. What makes damping off so frustrating is how quickly it can erase weeks of effort. This is one reason hydrogen peroxide often shows up in seed starting routines. The important insight isn't the treatment, it's the timeline. When seedlings fail, most people think about the seeds they lost, but the bigger expense is often time. A failed tray often means restarting the entire timeline. And in shorter growing seasons, lost time can become lost production. A missed harvest costs money. A delayed season can cost opportunity. The decision shift becomes, protect seedlings before symptoms appear instead of waiting until something goes wrong. Hydrogen peroxide isn't a guarantee against damping off. Environmental conditions still matter, but prevention is often cheaper than rescue, especially when time itself becomes part of the cost. 7. Oxygenating compacted soil. This next use looks simple on the surface, but it reveals one of the most expensive mistakes in home gardening, trying to solve the wrong problem. When plants stop growing well, many gardeners instinctively reach for fertilizer. Growth slows. Leaves look weak. Production drops. The assumption is obvious. The plant needs more nutrients. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it isn't. In compacted or poorly aerated soil, roots may struggle even when nutrients are available. That's one reason hydrogen peroxide occasionally enters the conversation, as gardeners look for ways to improve oxygen availability around roots. The important realization isn't about oxygen. It's about misdiagnosis. One of the most expensive gardening mistakes isn't having a problem. It's spending an entire season solving the wrong problem. A gardener sees weak growth and assumes nutrients are missing. More fertilizer gets added. Then another application. Then another adjustment. Weeks pass. Growth still struggles. Not because the plant needed more fertilizer, because the real issue was never identified. That's why this cost is larger than it first appears. You're not just wasting fertilizer, you're potentially wasting an entire growing season while chasing the wrong answer. In other words, the season isn't failing because gardening is hard. It's failing because the diagnosis was wrong from the beginning. That's a different kind of loss entirely. That's what makes this mistake expensive. The loss often looks harmless while it's happening. The decision shift becomes, before spending more money, make sure you've identified the actual bottleneck. Because solving the wrong problem for an entire season is often more expensive than the problem itself. Because sometimes the cheapest improvement isn't buying something new. It's stopping the purchase that was never helping in the first place. By now you may have noticed something. Most of these savings didn't come from finding better products. They came from buying fewer products. And the final two discoveries take that idea even further. 8. Reusing old pots safely. Most gardeners have done this. A plant dies. The container gets pushed into a corner. Months later, it's still sitting there. The next season arrives and the easiest solution seems obvious. Buy a new pot. But that's where an interesting hidden cost appears. Many containers are thrown aside not because they're damaged, but because people aren't confident they're ready to be reused. Hydrogen peroxide is commonly used by gardeners as part of a cleaning process for pots and containers before replanting. The practical value isn't really about cleaning pots. It's about preserving value. Containers simply make the lesson visible. One of the most expensive gardening habits is replacing useful assets before their value has been fully extracted. Containers are just where most gardeners notice the habit first. Convenience often disguises itself as necessity. That's where the realization changes. Earlier we talked about avoiding purchases. Now we're talking about extending the life of things you've already paid for. That's a much bigger category of savings. The important question isn't whether a container can be reused forever, it's whether it needed replacing yet. But many containers get replaced long before they actually need to be. The decision shift is simple. Before replacing, ask whether rehabilitation is possible, because every item you continue using is one less item you have to buy. And that idea becomes even more powerful in the final use. 9. Keeping cut flowers fresh. Longer. At first glance, this might seem like the smallest use in the entire video. In reality, it may be the one that changes how you think about all the others. Many gardeners use hydrogen peroxide in water arrangements because it can help support cleaner conditions for cut flowers. Useful, practical. But that's not the real reason this item belongs at the end. Think about where this bottle has appeared throughout the gardening process. Before planting, during germination, during seedling growth, during disease prevention, during plant recovery, during maintenance, during sanitation, and now, after harvest. That's a completely different type of value. Hydrogen peroxide is unusual because it can continue creating value at multiple stages of the same growing cycle. The hidden realization isn't about flowers, it's about overlap. Most gardeners don't notice product overlap until they look back and realize how many purchases were solving versions of the same problem. What makes hydrogen peroxide unusual is how often it overlaps with jobs people assume require separate products. Most products create value once. Hydrogen peroxide keeps creating value across multiple stages of the same growing cycle. That changes the way you evaluate every purchase. Instead of asking, "What problem does this solve?" you begin asking, "What else in my garden already solves part of that problem?" Because once you start asking that question, something uncomfortable happens. You begin noticing how many products were purchased to solve jobs that were already partially covered by something else you owned. And that's the question that often exposes unnecessary spending. And that's the real opportunity most people miss. At the beginning of this video, hydrogen peroxide probably looked like a household product with a few gardening applications. By now, the more important lesson should be something else. Every stage of gardening creates opportunities to spend money. Starting seeds, managing pests, treating disease, replacing plants, buying fertilizer, replacing equipment, managing harvests. Most gardeners naturally evaluate those expenses one at a time. Problem appears. Product gets purchased. Problem appears again. Another purchase follows. What hydrogen peroxide demonstrates is a different way of thinking. Not every problem requires a new product. Before spending money, ask a harder question. Am I buying a new solution? Or am I buying a second product for a job something else already performs? Hydrogen peroxide isn't always the answer, but learning to ask that question changes the way you buy garden products. That single question may eliminate more unnecessary garden spending than any individual tip in this video. And that's ultimately the lesson hidden inside every use we've discussed. The biggest garden savings are rarely dramatic. Most don't come from discovering a miracle product, and they usually don't come from one huge decision. Instead, they come from dozens of small expenses that never happen. A product that doesn't need to be purchased, a plant that doesn't need to be replaced, a harvest that isn't lost, a container that gets another season of use. That's why hydrogen peroxide continues to show up in so many gardens. Not because it's magical, not because it solves everything, but because it exposes how many purchases were solving jobs you may have already covered. The next time you're standing in a garden center looking at another specialized product, take a moment and look back at everything you already own. Because the biggest lesson in this video isn't that hydrogen peroxide has 9 useful applications. It's that many gardeners slowly accumulate products without ever noticing how much overlap exists between them. And once you see that overlap, it's hard not to wonder how many purchases were solving problems you had already solved. And if that's true, the real question isn't how much hydrogen peroxide can save, it's how many purchases were never necessary in the first place.